Thank you, DB. And thank you all for joining us this year. It's wonderful to be here and to present once again. Interesting when, I guess Dominic and DB came to me and said the theme of our conference this year is the one thing I wish everyone knew about culture. And literally without thinking, I responded, well, mine's going to be, it's not the same thing as climate. It came to me automatically, it's really the first thing I thought of. And I committed to that. And I guess later that evening I thought, so why did I say that? That's got to be the most boring topic for a bunch of people to hear about. I mean, I'm fascinated by it, but I'm the guy who writes surveys about climate and culture. No one else is really going to be all that intrigued by what's the difference between culture and climate. But, I was sort of stuck with it, so I spent the next few weeks trying to figure out how in the world am I going to make this interesting. And I guess what I basically found out is that there really isn't any way to make it interesting. All right, so, there are no pictures in here. There's nothing really fun. But hopefully I will share with you some ideas that will be helpful for you in bringing about culture change, sort of recognizing what culture is, how it differs from climate, and how you can bring the two things together to actually make some progress with culture. One of the interesting things to me, again, probably not to you, but I had that automatic reaction to the question, what do you want to speak about? It's got to be the one thing I wish everyone knew about culture. Again, it was a very quick reaction. I did not have to think about it. Okay, I knew exactly what my answer was. Just like any good academic who studies culture, the answer is it's not the same thing as climate. That's what I want to talk about. The really strange thing is, though, that's sort of culture operating, if you know what I'm saying. In our cultures and our subcultures, we have things that we don't even recognize are like automatic responses. We answer certain things very quickly, very much without thinking. It's sort of second nature. It's intuitive. And that's one of the very interesting things about culture that differentiates it from climate. Today I'm going to talk about a number of other things and how everything is different, and we'll see if I can make it a little bit interesting. Culture is its values and beliefs on the one hand, its norms on the other hand. For you and Synergistics purposes and for the purpose of the organizational culture inventory, we define culture as a system of shared beliefs and values that can lead to norms and expectations that guide the way people within organizations approach problems, approach their tasks, and interact with one another. So there are sort of two sides to it. There are these values and beliefs on the one hand. They may be relatively subconscious, relatively latent, relatively invisible and covert. And then on the other hand, there are sort of like the manifestations of these values and beliefs, specifically behavioral norms, norms guiding the way people act, behave, to some extent, the ways they even think. In our parlance with our surveys, we call the values and belief side ideal culture. We call the norm side the actual or the current culture of the organization. Make sense so far? Climate, on the other hand, is sort of more about perceptions, shared perceptions within organizations, what people see around them, how they collectively view the organization. It's based on senses. It's like observing. It's It's seeing what's around you, either visually, hearing about it, sense of touch even works sometimes. Climate is perceptual. For me, it also includes attitudes. For some people, attitudes are not part of climate, but I like to include them in there. Things like job satisfaction, engagement, attitudes about how effective the organization is along various criteria. Many of these attitudes are considered by some to be outcomes of the perceptions as well as outcomes of the culture. Culture is relatively, as I said, invisible. It's latent. We really can't see it. It's there, but it's not highly salient. It's cognitive. It's what we think about. It's turning things that we perceive into meaning, trying to organize our thoughts and coming up with beliefs about how things work. The people who I know of who originally wrote about culture are very heavily into culture as being a tool for describing groups of people. One of my professors years ago back in undergraduate school and later in graduate school wrote a number of books about culture. His name was Edward T. Hall. He wrote a book called The Hidden Language, another one called The Silent Language, another one called The Hidden Dimensions, third one, Beyond Culture. He used to go live with Indian tribes in the United States and peoples elsewhere in Africa. And he had one interest, and that was understanding the way they are, why they do the things they do, what drives their behavior, what the assumptions are. And a lot of what he focused on was learning about culture through their discovery, people's discoveries of what works. And, what works to survive, what works to solve problems, what works to get tasks done, and how those beliefs about what works and how behaviors are related to outcomes become sort of second nature and part of the culture. There was absolutely no interest whatsoever in changing the culture. Sort of reminded me of my original field at the University of Illinois and the University of Michigan of organizational behavior. It's mainly understanding organization and building concepts so that we can describe organizations and sort of understand why organizations do the crazy things they do. Climate is very different. Climate is out of really the field of organizational development. In the United States, there was an early climate survey. Climate was made to be measured by surveys, unlike culture. There was a very famous one by Litwin Stringer. Some of you may have heard of it. The climate survey I was most familiar with was the Survey of Organizations, which was written by our director. His name was Rensis Likert. You may have heard his name. A lot of people mispronounce it as Likert. He developed survey questions. Likert was a brilliant guy, and besides developing surveys, he wrote a lot about organizations and what people perceive in organizations. And he sort of casually called it the climate of organizations. It was meant to be measured. It was meant to be quantified. It was meant to be assessed through the use of survey techniques that he developed. Very different from culture. Climate sort of was invented as a construct to help change organizations. Yes, to some extent to understand organizations, but really more so through the field of organizational development to change them. So these two things that we're talking about are really different. They're strongly related, but they have different characteristics. And in a way, one is to understand organizations, the other is to change organizations, culture and climate, respectively. And sometimes when I think about it, it makes a lot of sense to me. For many of our clients, trying to change their cultures directly through their cultures is very, very difficult. And part of the problem is their cultures are so bad that they can't initiate change using current values and current norms. But it's also because cultures are inherently difficult to change, they're inherently resilient to change, they are long-lasting. At the same time, they are quite impactful. Here's the dilemma for people like yourselves as leaders, as consultants, for people like me as someone interested in cultural change and organizational development. Culture is much more stable than climate. At the same time, that's usually what we want to change. Because if you want lasting change in an organization, you've got to change the culture. Otherwise, things keep reverting back to their original state. So climate is easier to understand. It's easier for us to measure. I found it very difficult to write a culture inventory. It took me many years. But culture is more fundamental, and it's more important to change. So the answer to the dilemma is a more important target for change. Culture is more difficult. So to work with this, the key is to try to change culture by changing climate. Focus on dimensions of climate that we know are related to and reinforce things like the constructive cultural styles. And if we do that, we can actually make progress over time in taking a defensive culture and transforming it into a relatively constructive culture. So in other words, we're using culture and measures of culture to figure out what it is we want to change. But in fact, we're focusing on things that are more salient, more tangible, more understandable in order to make those changes. Uses of culture and climate, following what I just said, in carrying out a cultural change program, in understanding organizations, in teaching classes on organizational behavior, we can use culture to promote a deep, robust, very powerful understanding of what an organization is, why people in the organization do the things they do, and why the organization is relatively successful or unsuccessful. From a change perspective, we can also identify espoused values. I think one of the things that became very important with the organizational culture inventory was the ideal version, where we literally were using this language of the circumplex to enable people within organizations to describe the ideal toward which they would like to work. Describe actual culture as well and identify the gaps, what styles, what norms are stronger than they should be given our values, and what norms in fact should be increased in strength given our values. And interestingly, culture can be used to initiate change because we can see these gaps and we can say, you know what, we've got to change things around here. And then later on, culture can be used to sustain change because it is relatively stable and resilient. Climate can be used to take action. Organizational climate, again, in many ways, was an artificial construct invented to help people change and improve organizations. It can be used to operationalize values and beliefs as behavioral norms. So in other words, climate is the living part of change, and it can send people messages that tell them to think and behave in new ways. I will get back to that because that's one of the important concepts here. Close ideal actual culture gaps, and also because climate is relatively tangible, relatively visible. It's something we can talk about more easily. We can use climate to initiate change and implement change. This is the beginning of our model of how culture works. Many of you have probably seen this. Many of you have possibly used it in your own cultural change efforts. I'm going to talk about this model today in terms of climate and culture. Okay, something which I sometimes do, but I'm really going to accentuate it today. When we look at the organizational culture inventory and the circumplex that we develop for the ideal culture as well as the current culture, we're talking about values on the one hand and norms on the other hand, as I said earlier. Both are culture. We're talking about culture, we're sort of talking about what's desired, what people believe will really work well on the one hand with the ideal, and then what the current state is on the other hand with the actual circumplex. We typically get this kind of profile for the ideal, and you've probably seen many profiles like this. You saw the profiles that DV put up earlier, or I'm sorry, that Mary put up for leadership impact across countries. Usually with these ideals, we see very strong extensions in the constructive styles. We sometimes see extensions in the defensive styles for the ideals, depending what country we're in. But in our Anglo countries and in many of the Germanic countries, Scandinavian countries, the ideal profiles look like what we have up here. And these are, again, ideal cultural profiles for organizations. Basically, what these ideal cultural profiles mean is that people believe if we have cultures within our organizations that accentuate achievement styles, self-actualizing styles, humanistic and affiliative styles, things will work. People within the organization will be better able to solve problems, both individually and collectively. They'll be able to carry out their tasks better, and the organization will be in a better position to reach its goals. We've been doing ideal profiles for about 35 years now with the OCI, and we still very consistently get these kinds of profiles in the US, in Great Britain, in South Africa, in other Anglo countries, Australia, and New Zealand. Interesting thing is these profiles are very consistent across industry types. So we get them top-heavy, constructive styles in schools, daycare centers, social service agencies. We also get them, though, in organizations where you wouldn't expect the constructive styles to be associated with effectiveness. The United States, the Federal Aviation Administration, the USS Enterprise, ballistic missile system engineers, organizations where things would seem to be more task-oriented, and there would be a necessity for possibly more power-oriented and more dependent-oriented cultures in times of crisis, or to get certain things done, or to achieve reliability, or to implement programs. These are the profiles we get. And just one of the things I want to tell you about these profiles, about these constructive profiles, and the reason why they're so generically applicable, is because organizations are complicated, and they have to, in a way, have different structures and have different cultures to solve different kinds of problems. Sometimes the cultures, the structures are very constructive and very organic and enable organizations to solve problems like adaptation, creating new products, et cetera. Sometimes the structures are a little bit more hierarchical and bureaucratic, and the culture is a little bit more defensive to solve problems around just getting things done when you need a chain of command and you have to execute very quickly. But what I have found, and apparently what people within organizations know intuitively, is that with a constructive culture, you can operate your organization either very organically and, of course, very constructively, or when you need to, people within the organization know how to and are willing to shift to very hierarchical, rule-oriented, somewhat passive and somewhat aggressive set of norms when needed. You can't do the opposite, though. So in other words, if an organization is highly passive and very aggressive in terms of its overall culture, it can do those things well, where a lot of structure is needed, but it cannot shift to a more constructive, more organic type of situation when needed. And apparently people think about this when they fill out the OCI ideal, because consistently, even for organizations like the Federal Aviation Administration and some military organizations, some nuclear power plants, we come up with this as the ideal. Given that, and given that we have so much evidence that the constructive styles are in fact related to safety, reliability, effectiveness, service quality, readership among newspapers, and other valued outcomes, things really work well when the ideal translates right into the current culture. And we see all kinds of outcomes related to that kind of ideal and current culture. We see positive desired outcomes at the individual level, like engagement, motivation, satisfaction, low stress. We see positive outcomes at the group and department level, teamwork, cooperation, coordination. And we also see positive outcomes at the organizational level, adaptation, profitability, growth, etc. Those outcomes, again, I'm calling part of climate, at least to the extent that they are reported by individuals. They show their attitudes, job satisfaction. They show how they feel about the organization and success. Some people may just call them outcomes, but I like to see them as part of climate. The other part of climate is sort of right here in the middle. And this is the part of climate that's perceptual. And this is the part of climate that actually leads to the current culture of an organization. It's part of climate where people, individually and together, look at everything around them within the organization. They look at the structures of the organization, the degree of decentralization or centralization. They look at things like formalization, the amount of rules. They look at systems, how reward systems work, how performance appraisal systems work. Are people rewarded for good work? Are they punished for making mistakes? They look at the social aspects of technology, like the job design of their own jobs and the jobs of others, seeing how much autonomy there is in the job, how significant the job seems in terms of having an impact on others, being able to complete an entire piece of work. And they look at the people around them, their skills and qualities, the behaviors that they're exhibiting, their leadership styles, how well they communicate. All of those things that people perceive collectively are processed and are translated into beliefs about how they should think and behave within the organization. So it's those climatic factors that actually have a great impact, or possibly a greater impact, on the current cultures of organizations than even the stated values. So that's climate and culture in terms of our How Culture Works model. I think the most important line here is probably the very bottom line. This sort of parallels the How Culture Works model, but in terms of just some selected survey questions. So in the organizational culture inventory, we ask questions about, well, to what extent should people participate? To what extent should people be involved in decisions affecting them? And I'm just using that question. In some organizations, and most organizations, in fact, respond and say, members' opinions and ideas are important and should be considered. It's part of the ideal culture, the humanistic style. If things are working well, and leaders are actually trying to put the values into place, they will, in fact, involve people in decisions. And that will be seen by members. Okay? It's part of the climate. They see that there is participation in decision-making. That then leads them to develop beliefs about what they're supposed to do. And people come to the conclusion that it is important, it is expected, and it is worthwhile for them to get involved and to share ideas, to make suggestions. That in turn leads to things like what we used to call high job satisfaction, high engagement. It also leads to better decisions and other positive outcomes. So that's sort of how it works in terms of our surveys, the organizational culture inventory for culture and the organizational effectiveness inventory for climate. Just very quickly, 3 different examples of general constellations of climatic factors that organizations can focus on in order to bring about specific types of cultural change. The whole general notion of involvement, getting people involved, there are a number of ways you can do it, and we measure involvement in the second column through various questions aimed at the distribution of influence, the amount of job autonomy, things like empowerment are measured. And if you focus on those factors, those climatic factors, literally over time, you can increase constructive norms like achievement and self-actualizing and decrease defensive norms like conventional and power. There are sort of other constellations of climatic factors that organizational leaders and consultants have at their disposal to accentuate and to focus on and trying to shift the culture. There's constellation around clarity, reducing ambiguity, emphasizing the mission, very, very clear goals, reducing raw ambiguity, interdependence, accentuating teamwork, cooperation, and doing it through rewards, job design, communication, et cetera, having an impact on certain other cultural styles. It seems to actually work. We have many organizations that have changed their cultures. To some extent, I think the 2 organizations that we've had presentations on already have used climatic factors, things that people sort of have control over, to affect, over time, changes in the underlying culture, changes not only in norms, in some cases even in values, even in underlying beliefs. So again, my point for today is that culture is not the same thing as climate. They are different, but they are strongly related. In a way, culture is the invisible, the very invisible part of the spectrum, a little bit more difficult to talk about, more difficult to describe, though we can do it to some extent with the organizational culture inventory. Climate, on the other hand, is the more salient, more latent, more malleable part of the equation, and we can focus on climatic factors, we can take action, we can do things even like change our leadership styles that other people will see will become part of the organizational climate. Those kinds of changes are observed. People process the information, they see what they are seeing, and they use that information to come up with new beliefs about how they and others should think and behave. And that ends up changing the culture. I hope I made that as interesting as possible for a dry and boring subject. And I thank you very much once again for joining us and for being here today. Thank you.